Welcome to Melting Pot. The topic of the discussion today, democracy and its discontents in an increasingly authoritarian world. And I have Dr. Simon Leitch as the guest for the show today. Dr. Simon Leitch is based in Brisbane and he taught international relations in Griffith University for the past 4 years. We'll start our discussion with some um, recent scenario because at the moment, as we are talking now, um, we saw movements for democracy in Belarus, and there are Black Lives Matter movement in the US. I hope, Simon, we're going to discuss some of this issue in our show. But before the start of our discussion today, Simon, let me welcome you to the show. I'm very happy that we're talking in a
Oh,
show.
thanks very much. I assure you, I'm not one of the discontents.
No, I mean, we'll figure it out. I mean, let's see who. But before we start our discussion, why don't you give us a brief overview of what liberal democracy is, how it impacts on citizens' lives and growth, and what are the other political systems that rules the world, and how they're different than liberal democracies.
The first thing about liberal democracies is we have to distinguish between a liberal democracy and merely an electoral democracy. Liberal democracies require everyone to have equal rights under the law, a theoretically equal stake in the political system. We don't just have voting. Voting is done in lots of systems that are authoritarian. They're done to legitimize regimes. They're done in very unfair ways. Often you're told effectively who you can vote for. Liberal democracies, anyone should be able to theoretically stand for office. People should be able to have free speech. They should be able to participate in political processes without the government constantly harassing them and so forth. These are things which are normal in non-democracies or in electoral democracies that do not have the liberal element. So people are free to vote, but you have to deal with the government thugs and things like that come around and destroy your party activities and so forth. So we require for a liberal democracy a free speech, an open political system, an equal stake, equality before the law, and a few other things like that that actually make it liberal as opposed to simply electoral. Most of the world does not have a liberal democratic system. The many democratic systems, as I said, use the ideas of democracy for legitimacy, but they are not in fact liberal democratic in any sense. And we are gradually, I think, which is what we're seeing in all these protests, we're seeing people being increasingly discontented with what liberal democracy brings. But liberal democracy has done a lot for its citizens over the past 100 years. It's only new, and it has effectively delivered over the past 100 years more and more rights for all those who live in liberal democracies.
What are the discontents of liberal democracy people are saying today, in your view?
Well, I think liberal democratic systems have essentially reached their peak, or at least they have plateaued in the amount of economic benefits they can give to their citizens at this point. With the current model of the democratic system was moving towards free markets, free movement of people, open borders and things like that. And I think those things are to some extent creating problems for the liberal democratic system. So having open free markets where all your jobs are exported to other countries is a problem for a lot of the middle class. People are having problems with housing. People are having problems affording education. Things that previously we were advancing in, essentially we have now stagnated. Incomes in real terms have stagnated. As I said, housing prices going up. When your incomes are stagnating means effectively you're pushing people out of the middle class. You're disenfranchising a large number of people. And given that all our jobs, productive jobs, are continuously being either exported or they're facing competition from other places that don't have the same labour rules as we do, labour rules or environmental regulations and so forth, the competitiveness of the West is declining. The competitiveness in the economic sphere of liberal democracies is declining. And so I think liberal democracies are having a harder time providing improvements in terms of what they're delivering to their people. I think basically what my parents' generation received in terms of the economic and social outputs of liberal democracy are either the same as my generation or are declining and in decline at the moment.
Would you, on top of your head, um, share with the viewer today, like, is it the kind of feelings that are sweeping over the liberal democratic world at the moment among a lot of people, or is it among the critics? So is it a general sentiment, or is it a fringe sentiment?
I think dissatisfaction with liberal democracy is becoming more and more entrenched, at least amongst a broad part of the middle class. There are many people who think there's essentially no problem with the system. That is true. There are many people who are perfectly satisfied. There are many people who are satisfied but are looking just for cosmetic improvements. And a lot of people, to an extent, a lot of people would put themselves into that category. I think a lot of the discontents would say we're really just looking for certain improvements. We're not looking to any fundamental change to liberal democracy. But I think the concept that liberal democracy is in some way fatally flawed and that it needs to be replaced by another system is spreading. And we have seen that disturbingly with the plaudits that places like China are receiving for the things that they have delivered for their people. People are often looking at China and saying things like, oh, well, the Chinese can get things done. Their system might not be democratic, but they get things done. I think this is a pretty silly way to look at it. You can get a lot of things done by throwing people in jail and removing the rights of your citizens and having low labour standards and all that sort of thing. But I think that sentiment is now becoming increasingly mainstream, the idea that actually non-democratic or non-liberal systems have some virtues which the liberal democratic world increasingly does not have.
Um, could you give us like three key points about the difference between liberal democracy as a political system and authoritarianism as political system, how they impacts on the growth of citizens?
Well, it's hard to say because so many systems, so many authoritarian systems come out of a previous system that was dysfunctional, right? And so a functional authoritarian system is capable of delivering a lot of benefits compared to complete anarchy. So when we talk about how does a new authoritarian regime that is stabilizing the country, that is delivering law and order, and that is delivering economic improvements, how does that compare to other types of autocracy or non-democracy? Obviously, it improves a lot of things for its citizens. Now, that does not mean that you have to live under authoritarian regimes to get those benefits. But the fact is there are many regimes in which the non-democratic regime has delivered an awful lot of improvements. So we have to make a distinction between what people are looking for from their government. In some places, when you have very little, you will go for an authoritarian government if it can provide law, order, stability, economic growth. And these things sometimes cannot be provided by a liberal democracy. So when we say, what does a liberal democracy provide? Well, that depends. If you're at the moment having your house burnt down by rioters and you're living in increasingly precarious situations as a wage labourer with no savings and no house and so forth, well, you could look at an authoritarian regime and say, well, they provide a lot more benefits than a liberal democracy does. So I think the distinctions, if you like, the theoretical distinctions between liberal democracy and or autocracy, dictatorship, electoral democracy, whatever you want to call it, the difference between authoritarian and non-authoritarian systems are real, but it doesn't mean that the effects on citizens are always better in liberal democracies. We have to look at what the alternative is, what the alternative was to those systems as well.
Let us look around the world for a while. We have seen photos coming out of Belarus where people are demanding an end to autocracy. We've seen photos where people are taking the streets under the Black Lives Matter movement to demand an end to racial discrimination within the criminal justice system, within the liberal democracy. We've also seen gruesome killing of um, Muslims praying in Christchurch, New Zealand. Um, and it seems that many in relation to the Christchurch attack, it seems that there are people out there who believe that it is their moral duty to protect what they say their way of life, and if it is necessary, they're gonna kill people. Um, so in general, what we see is that many people in the West and East are not happy with their political system, whether it is democracy or autocracy. What is your opinion about it? What are the things you think have gone wrong?
Well, I think in the case of the autocracies where people are protesting, they are looking for the kinds of freedoms that liberal democratic states have and which they are denied, whilst conversely on the liberal democratic side, people in liberal democratic states, I think, are concerned that either their society is changing for the worst, or that liberal democracy is not providing the right kind of rights for them. So in Belarus, people want to be able to participate in electoral politics and have their own political parties, and get the government out of the hands of a small group of entrenched wealthy leaders who have no respect for human rights. Whereas in the West, I think people, when I say the West, I mean broadly, including New Zealand all the way through Europe and North America and so forth, we see people who think that the liberal democratic system is simply not providing them with everything they want. That it's all very well to have voting if your community is not doing well economically, if you feel that the police are being too heavy-handed with you, if you feel that you can't express your rights adequately, the rights, theoretical rights, are no good to you. So a lot of the protest movements are really yearning for liberal democracy to live up to its name, and I don't know what chances there are of achieving many of the aims of some of the protesters, because many of them, their demands are very difficult to understand from a pure policy perspective. I mean, trying to get the police not to shoot people, well, that's going to be very difficult, I'm afraid. Police are out there in high pressure situations. They are people who have to make split-second decisions under a great deal of pressure. I think it was 24 unarmed white people have been shot in the United States this year, 16 unarmed black people. There's clearly a broader problem that goes beyond race. I don't know how those things will be solved. So I don't know exactly how you can answer some of the demands of the protesters, and some of them, such as those who decided to set up their own commune and so forth. It's probably not the way. That's probably not the way you're going to achieve it across the rest of the United States, I'm afraid.
And that's a pretty contentious issue. But I was thinking, like, the point about people are being unhappy in both system, right? I mean, more and more people seem to be unhappy. And if you talk about middle class being unhappy in liberal democracies, middle class in other places, for example, the country I am from, Bangladesh, are not happy too. I mean, there is a pattern. It may also have something to do with the wealth distribution. What do you think?
Yeah, I think wealth distribution is obviously a big driver of a lot of the dissatisfaction. The fact that a very large boom has continued in the stock market for these last few years, whilst the rest of us who aren't in the stock market have not done very well, sort of tells you that there's been a serious decoupling of the rich from the middle class from the lower class. That's clearly a problem. There's a inability of Western and other countries to solve the problem of wealth inequality, that once you've made a certain amount of money, it is much easier for you to get richer than it is for a poor person to get rich. So there's a lot of inequalities in the system. How they're going to be addressed is very, very difficult to say. I suspect that longer term, some parts of the liberal trading system and some parts of our economy are going to have to be greatly reworked. We can't have a system in which everyone is forced to compete for housing, for instance, close to where you work at prices that are 10 times the median income, and expect people are going to be content with that. That's just simply not going to happen. So there's going to have to be something done about housing. There's going to have to be something about incomes. There's going to have to be something done about the competing with the poorest workers in the world for your wage. These are all problems inherent to the liberal open order trading system and with free markets more generally. Again, I'm not sure how any of this is really going to be solved in the end. because there's a very big picture at work. There's a big picture about how we build our cities, how we produce things, where we get our materials from. This is all a big picture problem for the economy, and the people who have been hard hit by it are really the middle class. And rather than dealing with the big picture issues, we tend to get stuck in media cycles of talking about one particular incident here and there, or debating pronouns, or talking about very niche issues. These are things which really won't actually satisfy a vast majority of the working class, and therefore really have nothing to do with solving the problem, but they take up a lot of our bandwidth. They take up a lot of discussion time. So yeah, people are unhappy about income distribution and housing and all those sorts of things. And I think most of the problems would go away if people were more satisfied with wealth distribution, the cost of essentials and the cost of housing. I think that yes, a lot of problems would be solved. A lot of other discontent would disappear if liberal democracies were able to provide those things.
I want to cite some reports about a worrying trend about the decline of democracy across the world at this moment. For example, according to the Variety of Democracy Index, a platform of 50 social scientists who work with over 3,000 country experts worldwide says the world is facing a decline in democratic traits. It says that for the first time since 2001, autocracies are in the majority. 92 countries, home of about 54% of the global population, are now live in autocracies. They do 54% of the global population live in democracy, and almost 35% of the world population, that means 2.6 billion people, live in autocracies. How significant is this trend for our time, Simon? Do you think our way of life in the West may get affected by this worrying trend?
The short answer is yes. It's very worrying, and yes, I think we'll be affected. But I think we should understand the cause of some of those statistics. The first thing is that we have quite a few new countries. When I say new, I mean post-Cold War countries, so entering the system in the past 30 years. Most of them, and those that came out of the decolonization period as well, these are new countries, often very unstable countries, and these countries are going through a phase of a nationalist phase, if you like, often trying to create stability, trying to create independence, and often there needs to be a prolonged period of authoritarianism before countries can move to democracy. And as these are new countries, you would expect that it would take a while for them to move to democracy. We can hardly expect, for instance, that you'll have a functioning democracy when you divide Sudan into two, and now you have two extra countries. We can hardly expect there'll be two functional democracies really quickly. More likely, they'll inherit many of the problems of Sudan, and they'll gradually, hopefully, work out their problems over a long period of time. This is one of the trends. So new countries, new unstable countries, new nationalist countries, all entering the field at the same time and giving numerical superiority to the authoritarian regimes, when really that's not a major threat to us, if you like. It's not a major threat to our way of life. The major threat to our way of life is that a very small number of dictatorships, specifically China, have concentrated almost all the world's growth in the last few years. Nearly 90% of the real growth in output, economic output in the last 10 years has come from China, just one country. And several other dictatorships are up there with a lot of the rest of that, 10, 12%. That's really, really worrying. The West has not had to deal with living with a country that has an adversarial system for a very long time, and which has an equal or greater strength. And I suspect we'll have a lot of problems dealing with authoritarian regimes that have as much economic and political clout as liberal democratic regimes had before them. And particularly in the case of China, unlike any authoritarian regime before, very much unlike the Soviet Union, and very much unlike communist China that preceded modern fascist China, the Chinese have managed to successfully penetrate all of our markets and gain dominance in most of our supply chains for many of the goods that are critical to running our society. That's incredibly dangerous. Many of our corporate entities do exactly what the Chinese say. Free speech is being censored out on behalf of the Chinese government. This is a serious challenge to our system, and I suspect it's one we'll have a lot of difficulty answering.
Is it an Australian problem, or you see this trend in other places too? I mean, for example, I know in Norway there is not much Chinese influence. So the examples you cited, was it specifically in relation to Australia?
No, it's a global problem, and Norway has its threats as well in the sense of the global supply chains that I was just referring to. Political influence is a little bit different. In Australia's case, the Chinese government saw in our relatively small population size, our open market, our open democratic system, they saw an ability to influence a country very easily and try infiltration techniques of various kinds, full spectrum infiltration techniques, as they would say. And in that, they were very successful, and small countries have felt the brunt of Chinese political and economic penetration much more quickly than larger countries have, and close countries will feel it more than further away countries. So yes, Norway feels the problem less than Australia does, but some of the fundamental problems they will still feel. And keep in mind that Norway has not been considered much of a strategic place for the Chinese to focus on. But as great powers have more and more resources, they tend to focus on more and more places. Hence, you can find a distant power like the United States somehow bombing countries like Libya, Yemen, and Iraq on the other side of the world. Great powers tend to see their interests being everywhere, even amongst the countries on the other side of the world that seem to have no ability to harm the United States. I suspect China will be much the same.
Right. So how do you see the US-China relationship is unfolding in the coming days? So I'll give you like two scenarios. If Trump being reelected, what would happen? Mind you that there was a book written by John Bolton who claimed that Trump asked favor from Xi Jinping for electing him, whereas he maintained publicly he maintained an anti-Chinese rhetoric. So it's really a bit confusing for people like us, right? I mean, we don't know much, but putting aside all this noise and shows, so what is your analysis about the future?
Broadly, I think it's going to be very difficult for the United States to decouple, is sort of the term, decouple from China. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to essentially try to move away from having such close economic ties with China. It would be of great benefit to the United States if they did, and Trump has been the only person to make substantive moves on this since the first Bush administration, and ever since the end of the Cold War. Engagement with China, sending them all of our factories and intellectual know-how, ignoring all of their intellectual property theft, ignoring all their transgressions on human rights. This has been the mode of operation. And Trump has been the first person to really take substantive efforts in rolling that back. I don't know how far he would actually be willing to continue to roll back engagement with China. Simply because the business lobby is very powerful and the alternatives in this production chain will be very hard to set up, or be a medium rather than a short-term thing to try to diversify supply and demand and so forth. So I'm quite pessimistic that he'll be able to override the business community's desires to disengage from China. And for that matter, I suspect lots of other countries like ourselves will be in the same boat. It's not that we don't know that that China is attempting to do us a fair bit of harm. It's that the politicians don't want to find difficult alternatives, and living with China and continuing relations as they are and ignoring a lot of the problems seems to be easier at this stage than actually addressing them, which is fairly normal for politicians to ignore problems until they really bite you. I suspect that's what they'll just continue doing. It won't. I seriously doubt that Taiwan will be independent in 20 years' time. And again, I suspect that for all the rhetoric, I think nobody will fight a war over it. I suspect that as bad as Chinese-American relations can get, I suspect they'll stop short of war in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, in just about every other place. I think the West will broadly back down.
What would happen like if Joe Biden is being elected?
I think he will try to re-establish strong ties with China as quickly as possible, particularly seeing as his children are heavily involved in investment in China.
Who? Could you repeat it?
Oh, Hunter Biden, yeah.
Oh.
Hunter Biden just happened to establish a large investment group when his father was visiting. So
Right.
I suspect that if anyone has the both the kind of ideological desire and a personal interest, I suspect Joe Biden will want to reestablish ties with China as quickly as possible.
Right. We're going to come back to China again. Let me put focus on the European Union, and as we're talking that democracy is declining, that particular freedom index I cited, it also underlined that an European Union member, Hungary, has its first non-democracy as a member, and that index now class Hungary as an electoral authoritarian regime. In short, electoral authoritarianism means democratic institutions are imitative, and due to numerous systematic violations of liberal democratic norms, in fact, it the system adhered to authoritarian methods. So, I want to know what is your thought on that?
Well, I suspect a large part of this is simply that Hungarian people as a whole have been dissatisfied with the rules put on them by the EU, and that Orban and others like him are the kind of authoritarian strong men, if you like, as the media tends to put them. But I would just say nationalists, and say broadly more they're just nationalists who want to make sure that their country has more independence from EU institutions. And because of that, they have to fight essentially a proxy war against many of the liberal institutions within Hungary that are trying to keep them in the EU, and which are trying to paint the EU as the source of a lot of benefits for Hungary, as opposed to the source of a lot of problems for Hungary. And this ideological battle will continue for I think the next generation. I think that this will be a problem that's going to be entrenched now for at least a political generation, as some people want to detach, and more people think that this is reactionary, particularly in the face of immigration, which has just created, I suppose, more fuel for the fire amongst nationalists who are worried about the erosion of Hungarian identity and Hungarian nationality. These are perfect storms to get people debating what does Hungarian mean, what is the role of Hungary, is it distinct from Europe, and who are these Europeans, who are these other people to tell us how we should run our country. All of those are good questions. Orban thinks he has the answers.
No, we know that. I was thinking, like, isn't it a dangerous trait for liberal democracy sliding back to authoritarianism? Because this is the feeling that goes back to your opening statement. That is kind of you'd find this sort of sentiment all over now.
I'm not sure whether it's really dangerous in the sense that it threatens to destroy liberal democracy as a whole. I think that there is an inherent problem with liberal democratic systems of late, particularly in the EU context, which is that the EU is, for most people, a fairly distant institution, and Europeans from place to place, from country to country, are different. And a large number of people feel that they have the right to their own country, which isn't Europe as a whole. It is France, it is Germany, it is Hungary, it is Britain, and it's not Europe as a whole. And I think that these regimes are not, it's not necessarily dangerous to have a nationalist regime that wants to turn away from being known as Europe as a whole and now wants to be known as Hungary, specifically for the Hungarian people, with things done a Hungarian way. I don't think that's inherently dangerous. But there's no doubt that there will be some dangers in the process of separating, a Britain off or a Hungary off, or, for that matter, a Greece. There'll be some dangers because people are very desperate and consider this to be extremely important, not just for their identity and not just for their national survival, but, as I was alluding to at the start, for all of their future wealth, the wealth of their children, the threat that they feel from housing prices and from declining incomes, declining real income, stagnated real incomes, and things like this. These are all things that make them hark back to a time when we had our own country, these things weren't a problem. And so I think that this is going to be something that's going to really inflame a lot of emotion, and those kind of things are inherently always going to create problems in a political system. But whether it's dangerous longer term for liberal democratic systems, I don't know. I suspect you'll probably get people like Orban that tread on certain elements of the liberal democratic system, and maybe that will be permanent, maybe it won't be permanent. It's really hard to say. Maybe they will tread on those systems until they reestablish the kind of government that they want in the future. Whatever the Hungarian utopia is, if they find it, maybe they'll be liberal democratic perfectly well. Maybe not. We can't really say.
But I guess the intention behind my question is that there's one group that who redefine their national identity, right? I mean, there's like whenever you redefine identity, it means you're excluding people. That's how we have seen the theories of nationalism, and in reality, that takes place. For example, in Myanmar, it suddenly decide that Rohingyas, who have been living there for quite some time, are not Myanmar people anymore. Right? I mean, I always see that there is a sense of danger in excluding people. And if you see what is happening in India now, so they also, before this pandemic, they also tried all to exclude certain group of Indians as their citizens. So this trend, from that perspective, of exclusion and redefining national identity is kind of unsettling for social harmony. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting that you say the redefining, because the redefining of national identity here is not what is being done in places like Hungary. Just keeping the Hungarian example for a moment, the Hungarian people are an actual thing. The redefining of them to being anyone who crosses into Hungary is simply absurd. The German people are real. The Bengal people are real. I mean, these are specific ethnic groups, ethno-nationalist groups that for a very long time have either succeeded or have wanted to run their own countries, and which essentially want to do it slightly differently to someone else. That's I know it's a little bit strange to say, okay, the Hungarians want to do things to the Germans, for instance, or the Indians want to do things to do things differently to the Pakistanis. But broadly speaking, that's true. The idea that Vietnam and China are identical is simply false. That Vietnam is for the Vietnamese, that China is for the Chinese. In that sense, I don't think there's inherently anything problematic about it. States have existed for a very long time, set up as specific political communities for people with specific values. When Charles de Gaulle said that every Algerian is a Frenchman, this strikes me as completely insane. The idea that there was no difference in 1960 between the Algerians and the French is just so crazy. I can't believe I have to spell it out. But there are obviously problems with, as you say, classifying people and disenfranchising people and making them stateless, particularly when they've done nothing wrong. They've been born in a particular country. The Indian example, for many of the people in the fringes of the country were born there and are simply declassified as a citizen with no rights with the wave of a pen. Obviously, that's wrong. But really, we're not talking about that in a lot of cases. Really, we're talking about the ability of governments to control their borders, to have a national education and citizenship program that treats people within their borders in a certain way, and which controls access to the benefits of citizenship. Those things are not inherently problematic. It's really how you implement them.
Yes. I just want to ponder this point a bit further. Is when I said redefining, it means that I understand that there's a group of political community who have been living in a certain place for uh, his many years. Then you open the border. Then you bring people in, and you redefine that identity. That there are other people who would live as Hungarians among us, and then again you redefine that identity and say, no, you are not among us. Don't you see there is any problem?
Yeah, so that's what I was referring to in the terms of disenfranchising people in the case of the Indian citizenship law, and in case of Myanmar and other places. Clearly, there's a problem with how you go about this. But for many of these places, the alternative, again, you have to look at what the alternatives are. And for many states that are trying to craft a national identity, which can be very important for the cohesiveness of the state, we have to consider what those alternatives are and what the negative outcomes would be. The idea that you can easily run a multi-ethnic state, a multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-religious state, is a very new idea. And in fact, it's one that doesn't have much proof of concept. For Western countries that we hold up, just using Australia as an example, we hold up as being exemplars of multicultural society. Well, we'll see what happens when the 90% of the country isn't white, liberal educated and so forth. We'll see what happens when there are more Muslims, more Chinese and other things. Then we'll get a test of how multicultural, multi-ethnic societies work. But at this point, a lot of countries are not willing to actually do that. A lot of countries are not willing to say, hey, let's just have everyone who lives here be a citizen and have equal rights, even though they believe very different things, and even though they're adversarial often to our political system. A lot of people, a lot of politicians, a lot of countries are not willing to take that bet, especially regimes where they have a very deep, not just nationalist identity, but often a religious identity that goes along with their nationalism. India is set up as a Hindu state. That's why it exists. The idea that now they're going to throw that away and simply allow it to be Islamized, whether or not that there's any demographic chance of that happening, is not really the point. They're dealing with the theory of what India actually is. India is a Hindu state. It's a Hindu national state. It was set up for that purpose. That's why it's different from Pakistan. You can't walk away from that. In the future, we might have the Indian people broadly change their mind about the definition, if you like, of India. But at this point, it's actually others who are trying to redefine it, to suddenly say, oh no, everyone's actually Indian who lives here in that broad sense. That's not right. We can strive for that in the sense that we can say, look, it's wrong having a Hindu national state. I don't think a Hindu national state is a good idea. I don't think having any religious national state.
The reason there was so much protest is in 1947, when these two states were born. It was the Pakistan that was born as a Muslim state, but India remained, even though it was a Hindu majority state, it in constitution it was secular. So now people are complaining because they want to turn it to a Hindu state. So there are two things. One is the population and the constitution. So we're going to come back again. Let us go back to our discussion about liberal democracy. So we have seen, if you follow Hungary closely, and some of this point was touched upon when you talked about Hungary, you would have seen that the shift of Hungary's political discourse from democracy to what is now an electoral authority is embedded on anti-refugee narratives and attacks on the Central European University funded by a former refugee, now a billionaire, George Soros. And I actually have colleagues working in Central European University. And they were saying there was a great institution. And you see that sort of anti-refugee narratives elsewhere in the liberal democracies as well, and attacks on universities from the both sides, left and right. So there is group in the left to say who do not want controversial speakers to speak on campus, and there are people on the right who believe that universities are being problem. How do you think these social patterns are putting an impact in the liberal democratic societies?
Well, I think many of the people who work at universities don't have the same problems and concerns as the broader, if you like, indigenous working class of various countries. The Hungarian people, yes, their sentiment has been inflamed by the refugee issues and by the economic migrants. I mean, half of the people coming into Europe are economic migrants, not refugees. This exacerbates the problem for the broad middle class, and I think they're very concerned about the consequences of immigration. Yes. The universities, however, are broadly not concerned about those problems. Universities don't really consider immigration to be a problem. They don't consider nationalism to be a good thing. They don't really consider EU integration or Hungarian integration to the EU to be problematic in any sense. And to be blunt, they think that they're smarter than the Hungarian people are. So I'm not surprised there's a clash between the liberal intelligentsia and the nationalists. That's normal. That's happening in virtually every country. And that's one of the reasons for the success of Trump, for that matter. It's one of the reasons why people couldn't predict a Trump win. It's one of the reasons why Brexit wasn't predicted, because, again, the intelligentsia, the intellectual class, really can't see what a lot of the average people are thinking, and certainly can't feel what they're feeling. They don't have the same concerns. I think if you had to live in the communities that are receiving the not just refugees but immigrants more generally, and I use the term immigrants to include also wealthy people moving between states. If you looked at the concerns of the people who actually are competing for them with housing and so forth, and who are competing with them for social services, you would find that it's actually not just racism or xenophobia or things like that. There is an element of that, of course. Nobody's saying there isn't an element of that. But the problem is there are real concerns for people of the middle class who are gradually being displaced. And this is why the general theory of the great replacement is so popular amongst the right-wing nationalists around the West, that the indigenous working class is gradually being replaced by newcomers that work for less, and we're being told that it's all benefits of immigration and so forth, when we're being squeezed out of our housing, we're being forced to move further and further away from the places we work, and where incomes have stagnated. We're told that immigration is making us wealthy. Well, it's making a certain number of people wealthy, and it's depressing wage prices, which is good for the rich, but it's not good for many people, the average working class. And so I think the concerns are real in the sense that they come from a real problem in the political economy of Western societies. And this is being ignored by the intelligentsia, who just want to say you're racist. Your income isn't really stagnant because of the influx of Filipino workers or Mexican workers or workers from the Middle East. You just don't understand. You just don't understand that you're actually getting rich from them. You don't understand what free trade has done for you. You don't understand what immigration has done for you. Well, many of them do understand, and they don't like it too much.
Simon, let me please, could you explain one thing? Like, as you said, the middle class is not doing well economically, but their prophet is a super rich man, Donald Trump. How they see hope in him, because he is part of the problem, isn't he? He made money out of the same system.
Yeah. Yes and no. I mean, Trump is representative of a certain type of capitalism, and that's problematic. That's true. But if he's the only one that's actually going to say some of the things that need to be said, what's it matter whether he's rich or poor? The problem is people needed an alternative, by and large, or very large, if we're talking about the American context here. By and large, people were looking for an alternative, which neither the Democrats or Republicans were able to give them. Democratic politics in the United States was giving you a choice of two people who essentially had the same views on how the broad economy should be run. Yes, you might have differences between candidates on certain things in healthcare or certain things in infrastructure and certain nuance here and there, but by and large, the large trends which were affecting the average American were not being dealt with by the political class. They weren't being dealt with by the democratic system, the political class, or the two major parties. Trump came from outside of that and shook things up and said a lot of things that needed to be said. The fact is, if the American worker can't be free from some international competition, particularly from China, which competes extremely unfairly with industrial subsidies for everything, with very lax labor laws, with state-owned corporations that don't die and don't require private investment and so forth, with large-scale technology theft and these sort of things. if the American worker is forced to compete with them, they're going to lose. And they have been losing, which is why the American middle class has collapsed. It's why they've lost millions of industrial jobs, well-paying middle class jobs, and now China has them. This is just insane that the political class allowed this to happen. But not just the Republicans and not just the Democrats did it. They did it together. It was a bipartisan issue. And so someone had to come from outside of the political system and talk about that. The idea that you're not going to police the border with Mexico, the idea that you're just going to have continuous low-wage arrivals into a large part of your country is just insane. Again, this depresses the prices for the working class, and a lot of it is built on very big lies. So the idea, for instance, that people will not pick vegetables, or people will not work as a cleaner and things like this. People won't do it, so you have to have the immigrants do it. This is a complete lie. The problem is these people are coming from very poor places, and they're willing to accept a very low standard of living, and they're willing to work in terrible circumstances that Americans shouldn't have to work in, because we are better than that. Liberal democratic society can provide more for its people than it has been doing. But instead of doing that, you simply import very poor, very desperate people from countries where they've almost been killed, and you say, well, go pick my cabbage, and we're all happy. Well, no, actually, it means that the price for the picker of the cabbage is really low, artificially low. It means Americans can't get many of the jobs that they used to have because they're being replaced by foreign workers. And in combining with that is the pressures on infrastructure, which many of the immigrants don't pay for, and the problems in the political system. So I think it was a no-brainer in the sense, or Trump's success was a no-brainer, at least to the level that he was a formidable candidate. Even though he was a rich person, I don't think that was not here nor there, his personal wealth. Although I thought it would sink him at the end of the election. I thought his tax returns would probably
But
see him.
he's not a popular leader. He didn't get the most vote, but he won the electoral college. For me, maybe I'm being too naive to think that a leader for the cause should come from the people who are suffering. Whereas Trump is an outsider, he's a disruptor, but he's also part of the system. And if you see the case of Brexit, right? I mean, a lot of people voted for the leaders who are also filthy rich. So don't you see any contradiction here?
No, I don't see any contradiction between voting for someone who has ideas that you like and happens to be rich, and voting for someone who might have ideas that you don't like, who happens to be poor, who comes from you. I don't see that as any contradiction.
My point is, maybe those leaders are not committed to the cause.
Well, that may be true. It's hard to say what any political leader is committed to, because political leaders are inherently liars and cheats. So it's very hard to say whether they believe anything that they put out. However, Trump has made substantive moves towards changing some of the problems in the American economy, and China being just one of those things. But the rolling back of free trade more broadly, the rolling back of NAFTA, the rolling back of trade with China and so forth, and the control of immigration have all been very important to the United States, and will be more important in the future if the middle class is going to recover. And so if he's the only one that's going to talk about that, then I don't understand why this would be any contradiction, as particularly when the alternative was Hillary Clinton, who was getting paid $1 million to go and give speeches to Wall Street bankers, and still is. This is not a person who comes from us. I mean, if I went and gave a speech for $1 million to Wall Street, I'd want it on TV and publicized as well. But she goes around and makes hundreds of millions of dollars through talking to captains of industry, all given apparently on the expectation of nothing more than a speech. I mean, give me a break. These are people who have deregulated the financial industry and given the bankers a lot of profits. That's why Hillary Clinton gets paid, and both Clintons for that matter. So in the context of the alternative, which is the only way we can ever look at these things, the alternative between Trump and Clinton, well, if we're talking about wealth, I really don't see the difference.
What do you think is the current alternative, Trump and Biden?
A very difficult one. The other question, of course, is given Biden's age and potential cognitive decline, whether we're really talking about Harris rather than Biden at some stage in the term. This is something which people really have to reflect on. Personally, I think that neither of these candidates would I have favoured. I was personally more of a Sanders man back in the day, but those days are apparently gone. But if I'm confronted with the choice between the two of them, personally, I think there are many flaws with both of them. The main question is whether or not you feel that Biden simply returning to the way things were, which is, I suspect, what will happen, is acceptable to you because you don't like Trump and you don't like his handling of the pandemic and you don't like the way he is as a person. Personally, to me, many of the big issues in American politics have only just been dealt with transiently or not at all by the entrenched political class. So I'm perfectly happy to see an outsider continue to shake things up. And I would like it if the Democrats put a candidate up that I could say, yes, I definitely prefer him to what has been put up so far. But outside of Sanders, I don't see really any Democratic candidates that are much worth it.
No, the interesting thing about Trump is he is an inspirational figure to many people. So, for example, I met people in UK. They look up to Trump. Could you explain that phenomena? I don't understand it.
I think there's a couple of things. I think Trump's ability to take on the mainstream media and not give them much respect, I think, is something that a lot of people are somewhat in awe of. It was one of the reasons for his electoral success. If you ask an idiotic question, he'll give you an idiotic answer. I think calling CNN fake news and other organizations like that, I think, plays very heavily to a lot of what many people are thinking. And I think many of the outrageous things that he says, or things that strike normal people as outrageous, play very strongly with a large part of the community. I think when you talk about draining the swamp and when he attacks the entrenched political class, these are things that average people wish they could do. Average people wish they could go up and call Hillary Clinton corrupt, but we don't have the opportunity to do so. you see someone like Trump goes and wow, at least someone's saying it, regardless of whether or not we actually like Trump. And I think Trump, as I always say, he's not a very likable person. I don't think Trump is a very likable person. I don't think he's very good in front of a camera. He's not a very good speaker. There's a lot of flaws in his character and a lot of flaws as a candidate. But at the same time, there's many things he does that make you go, man, I wish I could have done that. I wish someone else had have done that.
Right.
And we see that with many aspects of his personality, that at least with Trump, to an extent, he's living the dream. He's going out and doing whatever he wants.
So, since we're talking about discontents of democracy, radicalization and extremism are two problems within democracy. We've seen reports in Australia that where media quoted intelligence agencies that radical rights are talking about an upcoming race war in Australia, and obviously it sounds quite alarming. And it's not in Australia, also in other places, like reports from some of the Muslim countries also underpin that due to lockdown, radical Islamists are reaching out to recruit people. What is your opinion about it?
Well, I will deal with the last part first, that there is no doubt that more access to the internet means more time spent in a particular bubble, which is usually fairly bad. It's been very bad for the political system to have people with social networks that are now all-encompassing, that are telling you exactly what you want to hear all the time, that are linking you up with like-minded people, that are preventing you from being exposed to new ideas. And Islamists through to white supremacists across the full spectrum, they have all taken the time during lockdown, if you like, to make sure that they've got their propaganda right, and they've got a lot of new members, I suspect. That's true. But this is merely a minor acceleration of a pre-existing trend. To go back to the first thing that you raised, the issue of the race wars amongst the Australian white supremacists, et cetera, I don't see this as being a serious problem in the sense that this is nothing new. The radical right has always talked about a race war. This is what, in the United States, of course, the Manson family attempted to trigger a race war with their murders. This is what the KKK was set up for. A race war, and talk of a race war is exactly how you know who the radical right is. It's the hallmark of the radical right. This is nothing new, and I consider this to be largely a media beat up because really I could go on to virtually any university campus, major corporation, workplace, work site, and ask for their white supremacists to put their hand up, and it simply won't happen. I could find quite a few Islamists, communists, socialists, many other people on the political spectrum, but I would be hard pressed to actually find a white supremacist. In the United States case, of course, despite all the hysteria that the left has about white supremacy, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville drew only 500 people. Every right-wing political group in the United States they could bring together only managed 500 people in a country of 307 million people. That's not too impressive. You can get more people at a Pokemon convention. So I'm really not concerned about a lot of those issues. But in the sense, I will say one thing, that in the context of the modern leftist movements like Black Lives Matter and anti-racism, etc., the general thesis of those groups is that Western countries are inherently racist because there's too many white people, that basically by having a white majority, it means there's systemic racism, that the racism permeates the system purely on the basis of white privilege, inherited by being a part of the majority. Logically speaking, using their own logic, this will be reversed when the demographic trends of the West favour non-white people. If that is true, those on the left are giving people who are white nationalists exactly the ammunition that they want. Why on earth would you want to be a minority?
But wasn't it like the American case is a bit different because the blacks have this long history of slavery, and there are many reports and studies that suggest that that mindset of ruling blacks as slaves is somehow being transpired within the framework of white supremacism in some places. So are you like, don't you see that history is important in Black Lives Matter movement in the US? I'm not talking about Black Lives movements in Australia or Norway. There were protests too because they have other contextual history. But I'm interested to know your point of view about that American context.
Yeah, well, of course, the United States has a history of slavery, as essentially every country does. The issue is whether or not black people in the United States essentially are able to express their rights and have control of their own destiny. And by and large, the statistics would suggest that if you stay in school, don't get married too soon, don't have children too soon, and hold down a job, then pretty much your prospects are the same between blacks and whites, which is what we would expect. Differences between groups are almost inevitable based on geography and culture and things like that. But I don't think that many of the core concepts of what the protesters are talking about in systemic racism in the United States are real. I suspect the main problem is what I bring back all the way to the start, that people are doing it fairly tough. I suspect the middle class and the lower class are doing it very tough. And the explanation for this, if you are black, is structural racism, whereas the actual problem is the structural, the structure of the economic system. And so I would tend to see most of the struggle as being fighting the wrong thing. I suspect that if you went right now to many of the people in Black Lives Matter movement as a whole, and said, what do you want? What can we give you? really a lot of the redress, a lot of the effective redress would be about income redistribution. And that a lot of them are talking about effectively having some sort of socialist redistribution. And in their case, they're talking about it along race lines. Well, remove the racial lines because the white people are doing it just as tough as the black people in actual fact. That's why there are more white people on food stamps than black people. And it's why there are really bad prospects for white people who are single parents, who live in rural areas, who are uneducated and so forth. The malaise that's affecting them is basically the same. And I think it's very counterproductive to racialize what is effectively an economic problem.
We will now focus on China-Australia relation. We are coming to the end of the show, but we still have like two major issues to talk about. And if we talked a bit about China-Australia at the beginning, and I know you wrote your PhD thesis on Chinese soft power. And we met at the time in Brisbane. And you remember we shared a big working space. There are only two people, you and me. And so, could you tell us a little bit about your thesis? And do you think your thesis may still be relevant?
Yes, still relevant in the sense that nothing really has changed. The basis of the thesis is essentially China, after the Cold War, needed to normalize itself. What we mean is, we'll take a step back. If I said, hypothetically, that Australia's major trading partner was Nazi Germany, people would be a little bit confused as to why our major trading partner was Nazi Germany. Yeah. People can agree how bad Nazi Germany was. It doesn't really have any defenders. We would say, really, can't you find somebody else to trade with? And especially if you were learning that Nazi Germany was getting very rich on the back of the things that you were sending to them to produce and that they were selling back to you. It would be even more confusing if you said that you had all their students come over to your campus. It would be very confusing if you said that you were allowing them to buy all your property and you were allowing them to invest in your market and so forth. And it would be very confusing if you were allowing their diplomatic representatives to speak on our television and to buy our radio stations and our foreign language broadcasts and newspapers and so forth. That would be very odd if we were allowing Nazi Germany to do that. Why? Because Nazi Germany is Nazi Germany. So it's got a bad reputation. Reputation matters quite a lot. It overrides a lot of it acts as a critical thinking shortcut. Nazi Germany equals bad. We shouldn't be dealing with them. We shouldn't be letting them do the things they're doing. China had to avoid that kind of tag. China is almost identical to what Nazi Germany was in 1938. I used to say to my students, the only difference between Nazi Germany in the 1930s and modern China is that Nazi Germany rounded up a religious ethnic minority and put them into camps by this stage. Now, of course, we are seeing exactly that happen in China, and the difference has completely evaporated. Of course, I always argue that they already did this because they already did this to the Tibetans and others, but this was largely, again, forgotten by most of the West. China, therefore, went on a diplomatic offensive through the 1990s to try to make sure that they had a good name, a good reputation, and that people didn't think that trading with China or having China buy our commodities or buy our newspapers or have stakes in many of our enterprises, this wasn't a bad thing. That what's your problem with China? Well, China's not the Nazis. I mean, I literally hear people say that. I literally hear people say, well, what's your problem with them? It's not like they're the Nazis or anything. This diplomatic offensive was the core of my work. It was looking at how China has moved to legitimize itself in international society, and how a non-democratic regime, indeed a fascist regime, it's not communist at all, it's fascist, how a fascist nationalist regime managed to delegitimize places like Taiwan, a liberal democratic system, how it managed to legitimize many of its territorial claims, and how it managed to legitimize control over supply chains.
So I have two more supporting questions in that regard. So what do you say to someone that you are being a bit naive about China? Are you anti-Chinese someone?
Well, anti-Chinese government, certainly. I can't see why I should be in favor of a government that doesn't allow free press, that doesn't allow free expression, that doesn't allow freedom of religion, I can't see that I should be in favour of this sort of entity. So when we say anti-Chinese, what we actually mean is anti-Chinese government. And yes, why should I be any other way? I'm a liberal-minded person who believes that you should be able to have freedom of speech and freedom of religion. I believe they should be able to appoint their own leaders, that people should be free from the constant monitoring, they should be free from the social credit system, I don't have to shy away from that. So I really take being anti-Chinese government as a badge of honor rather than being a slur.
Right. And do you think, are you conflating the idea of fascism with authoritarianism?
No. Many systems can be authoritarian without being fascist. That's true. Fascism has three main traits. It's corporatist, nationalist, authoritarianism. China fits that definition perfectly. So it has a corporatist system. It has no real private sector. All of the large firms that dominate Chinese industry, that dominate nearly half of its overseas output, its exports and so forth, they are controlled by Chinese party officials. If you have a company, even a foreign company worth more than $100 million, you have to have a Chinese Communist Party member on your board to make sure that the company is acting as the government would like it to act, as a supervising body. There is no political freedom, there is no freedom of expression, and it is a highly national power, highly nationalist power. That is, they are trying to create a state just for the Chinese, and they are trying to shape the ethnic identity of the state, which is why they have to round up the Tibetans and the Uyghurs and all the other ethnic minorities, and for that matter, why they have to do what they've done to Hong Kong, to make sure that there is not a separate identity within the country, that there will be no such thing as the Hong Kong people or the Tibetan people or the Uyghur people, and now the Mongolian people. They've just removed some of the rights, the language rights from the Mongolian people, because they don't want people speaking another language. They want them all to be Chinese, indistinguishable, and all subservient to the government. So they are fascist in the sense of nationalist, corporatist, authoritarian, fundamentally identical to Nazi Germany.
I want to cite the 2017 Freedom in the World report of the Freedom House, where they argued that populists and the autocrats are the dual threats of the global democracy. And the report further highlights following points. Point number one, modern authoritarianism has succeeded where previous totalitarian system failed due to new strategies of repression, the exploitation of open societies, and the spread of illiberal policies in democratic countries themselves. Do you want to say something on that point? Do you see that point is quite operational in the contemporary period?
I think people have to be careful about the use of the term populist leaders, because, of course, in democratic systems, there's not necessarily any problem with a populist leader. I'm not even sure really what the term means, except it inevitably means something that the more left-wing democratic people don't like. But in terms of the overall threats to the democratic system, yes, we have to be careful of places like Hungary, or for that matter, Poland, rolling back freedom of press and freedom of certain minorities and so forth, including sexual minorities. We have to be careful of these.
They banned, I think they banned or they stopped funding. I think they stopped funding gender studies in Polish universities.
Yeah. Those are small warning signs, which, yes, they may be indicative of a broader problem. We won't know, I think, for a significant period of time. I think it will take a while for these things to actually filter through and see where some of these leaders actually envisage their political battles to be, because I suspect it's not just those things, but we won't know until it's had time to sort of filter through the political system. I think overall, the new techniques that authoritarian systems have crafted, and the feeling that they have succeeded where previous systems have failed, that's really something to keep an eye on. Forget about populist leaders in the West and so forth. I think that the fact that authoritarian regimes have been able to give themselves a good name and normalize themselves and remove some of the moral conundrums that Westerners might have about dealing with these regimes is deeply disturbing. For instance, on television, we can see advertisements to visit multiple countries in the Middle East, as though there's no problem with visiting Islamo-fascist regimes. We can see all sorts of, I've got advertisements coming up for trips to non-democracies like Vietnam and China and so forth, and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other places, all coming up as saying these are destinations you should travel to, in news feeds and things like that. So why don't you visit Saudi Arabia and have a good time, see the sand dunes, just ignore the human rights issues. I think this is the penetration of ideas into our society, the normalization of these regimes through techniques as subtle as tourism ventures, as well as things being done on university campuses, is very, very troubling. And the fact that many of our corporations are bending over to do whatever these regimes want, and doing so more often, is very, very troubling. We can see the contradiction also inherent in the system, that companies like Nike will put out ads saying to believe in something even if it costs you everything, except of course if it's China. If you say something bad about China, well, we're going to drop you. So believe in something as long as it's not disagreeing with a dictatorship that gives us a lot of money. These kind of things are a serious threat to our future freedoms, particularly, as I say, when there's been a breakdown of our public and private lives, where we can now get fired from our jobs because of something you said about a foreign dictatorship a very long way away. That's deeply troubling. And these regimes have, as you point out, managed to succeed, at least in the sense of providing economic growth and national strength, where previous totalitarian regimes have failed or been very, very transient. And it is entirely possible that in 30 years' time, many of the dictatorships that are learning from the Chinese experience will be a lot stronger, and the West will be a lot weaker, or at least stagnant, in the face of many more dictatorships that have learned many of the techniques from fascist China.
The second point that report highlighted is that it pointed out to the hiring of political consultants and lobbyists from the democratic countries to represent the interests of autocracies, and they identify it is a growing phenomenon. And it also identified China is in the vanguard, but there are also what this report term as K Street representatives for Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Ethiopia, and practically all of the authoritarian states in the Middle East. So there are people from liberal democracies getting money from these authoritarian regimes and legitimizing, pursuing, advancing their interest as political consultant and lobbyist. And that's the claim of this report of Freedom House. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, it's definitely true, and it's actually been true for a very long time. It's very surprising that it has taken this long for them to actually talk about it. All the way back in 1991, China actually hired Washington lobbyists to try to get people to stop talking about the Tiananmen Square massacre, and the Chinese were actually quite surprised that they succeeded in doing so. It turned out that if you give a Wall Street lobbying firm $1 million, they will go and basically do whatever you want. That's what happened. And they were more surprised that this was actually surprisingly effective. So the general principle isn't just in lobbying firms, but also just in people-to-people contacts in businesses, corporations of all kinds. You can go to an awful lot of firms around the world and find that they have contacts in non-democracies where they'll say, oh, yeah, these people are very nice. We do good business with these people. Yeah, the government might not be very nice, but that's no reason not to deal with these people. I actually was speaking to someone who ran a shoe factory in Vietnam just recently, and they didn't have any problem, of course, with the Vietnamese government. That's not their issue. They're there to make shoes. And the idea that this isn't used to leverage certain political advantages is just absurd. It meant that they were beholden to certain things that the government would force upon them once the factory was there. and of course they're then participating, at least in a moderate sense, to some of the human rights abuses, because they are then running the factory according to the human rights practices that the Vietnamese government deems appropriate. None of these things were of concern to those factory owners. So it's not just the lobbyists, but it's then these people, these average people, become lobbyists. Because if we were to talk about saying, well, we don't think you should have shoes from Vietnam, they would be vehemently opposed. And these are Australian citizens working in our own country, in the manufacturing chain, who can go to the Chamber of Commerce and say, look, you have to get our politicians to stop cracking down on labour practice in Vietnam. Labour practices in Vietnam are very important to how my factory operates. So it's not just a professional lobbyist, it's a private lobbyist. And this is creating a very deep entrenchment of the status quo in our system. This is why it will be very hard for us to separate off our economic system from illiberal states. Liberal democracies are now deeply embedded in the economic system, and most of our citizens who benefit from this don't really see a problem.
I want to come back to this point on the populist leader, and even though you avoided talking about it, um, the reason I want to come back to that is that it's not just left. Is the reason the idea of populism uh,
What is
being
populism? What is it?
it's
Well,
like you work in an authoritarian regime. Sorry, you work in an authoritarian mindset in a democratic state. To simplify it, and Trump is a populist leader, according to many people. The problem with populist leader is that they like to hang out with the authoritarian leader. So it's been reported many times. So you have talked a lot about China, but there are other people out there like Vladimir Putin, and we don't know that Trump. What is the relationship between Vladimir Putin and Trump? Because there's a long history of U.S. Soviet Union um, contest, and in the through Cold War and other stuff. My point being is that the problem with populist leader is that they tend to favor authoritarian leaders, and that's a problem for people who are defending democracies in authoritarian states. Uh,
so you are suggesting that perhaps President Obama didn't deal with non-democracies. He didn't. Did he call Mubarak a dictator when he was about to be overthrown? Has he been to Saudi Arabia and shaken hands with the king? Did he not deal with Putin by saying we're going to reset relations? We're just going to ignore the invasion of Ukraine? What really? Trump is the only person who has to deal with dictators, really? Or the only person who is wanted to, really? Are
but
you suggesting there's not a history of American presidents cozying up to dictators around the world?
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm
I know that.
saying that, no, no, no. What I'm saying that being explicit and being implicit. So Obama, on the other hand, he also sent back a lot of people to Mexico, but there were less media reports on that. There are drone attacks, number of people being killed in distant places under Obama, and that includes a huge number of civilians. Um, and I see your point, but it's the point being is that populist leaders are. You don't agree with the term populism.
I think
I see your point. Yes, that's a good
I think it's
point.
very ill-defined. I think this actually goes to the heart of one of the problems with Trump. One of the problems with his electability and with his lack of appeal to perhaps half the population is that a lot of his policies are actually identical to what has been done before, but the substance and the style are two different things, and people don't like the style. The relationship with Putin, I don't think there's any really substantive relationship there. And I think if we just compare for a moment to his predecessor, if we compare to Obama, Obama actually asked Putin for electoral help. So we talk about collusion. Trump colluded with Putin to win the election somehow. There's really no evidence of this, but this is the narrative put forward. Whereas we actually have on tape Obama genuinely on tape colluding with the Russians when he turns to Sergei Lavrov and says, I will have more flexibility after the election, lay off me and pass on the word to Vladimir, will you? And Lavrov says, yes, I'll pass on the message. And he's openly colluding with Putin, and yet nobody has a problem with this. He walks around the world shaking hands with dictators and making speeches in Cairo, and they give him a Nobel Peace Prize. And the man gets a Nobel Peace Prize, even though he... Yeah, maybe. I think that would be quite funny if he did. But I would suggest that if Obama did some of the things that Trump does, he would have got another Peace Prize. I think that if Obama went and met with Kim Jong-un and shook his hand and crossed over the line, I suggest this would be lauded by a lot of people. I think this would be considered to be very constructive by a large number of people. He does it, of course, because he's a dickhead. People don't like him doing it. And I suspect it's much the same elsewhere in the world. The double standard is palpable, whereas Trump has not got the United States involved in more wars. Obama not only failed to withdraw the United States from Iraq and Afghanistan, he got them involved in 2 more conflicts. And yet apparently this is perfectly fine. And he was perfectly willing to support Mubarak as long as he could prove that he could do it. He would have been perfectly happy to support Gaddafi. He's perfectly happy to support the Saudis and any others. He didn't do anything when the Saudis marched into Bahrain. This is just normal things for a US president, looking after their own misguided sense of their interests. Trump does not even the same thing. I think Trump has been far better in some regards in a few of these areas, but he's treated to a complete double standard and called a populist as a result. Everyone has cozied up to the foreign dictators when it has apparently suited their interest to do so. Trump is no exception. He's the rule.
That's a good argument. I don't have anything to refute that. Wait at the moment, but Simon, thank you very much for
Thank you.
this show, and I hope we're gonna continue this irregularly in the coming days. And I'm looking forward to bring a Democrat in your show. That would be more fun, I think. And
I'm
you have a
sure.
good night. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Bye.